The wind owned the ridge. A stagecoach lay overturned in the ditch, one wheel still turning against the cold. Two horses down, one already dead, the other fighting the harness that pinned it. No driver. Beyond the wreck in the brush, a shape too large for the clearing. A dress torn at the shoulder. Blood dried dark along a temple that should not have been so still. A letter half buried in frost. A boot print crushed clean across the fold. Someone had hit her. Hard. Deliberate. The bruise on her jaw was no accident of the crash. Two fingers found a pulse. Thready, weak. But there. Alive. The letter spoke of a circled mark pressed beneath an agency seal. Of water that had once run clear and then turned deadly. Of a debt paid in blood long before this road. The mountain waited. The storm was only beginning. Something was already riding toward the ridge. Ironwood Creek, Montana Territory, 1882. The wind came down off the ridge like it owned the place. Because it did. Nobody argued with wind like that. Not the pines. Not the cattle. Not a man alone in a cabin with a fire dying slower than he wanted it to. Asa, the Whitlaw, sat close to the hearth. Boots off. Socks scorched at the toe from too many nights doing exactly this. Staring at flame like it might apologize for something. 38 years old. Broad through the shoulders in the way men get when the work never stops asking. Hands scarred. Jaw set. The kind of quiet that wasn't peace. It was just quiet that had given up trying to be anything else. On the table in front of him. A letter. Folded twice. Read maybe 40 times. Healthy bride. Hard-working. Ready for hard country. $100. Paid in full. He read it again anyway. Because that's what a man does when he's about to do something foolish. He rereads the proof that it's not foolish. Even when it is. $100 for a stranger. For someone to split the woodpile with. Someone to keep the cold from getting so loud in his own skull at night. Not love. He wasn't fool enough to call it that. Just company. Just a second set of hands on a ranch that used to need 20 and now made do, with one tired man and a horse older than his patience. He hadn't always been alone. Out here. There was a valley once, green in a way this ridge never was. Cattle enough to make a man proud without making him careless. A house with a porch his mother used to sit on, back when there was a mother. Back when there was a porch that wasn't ash. And a neighbor, Garrick Ambrose. Asa's jaw tightened just thinking the name. Because that's what the name did to him. Tighten things. His jaw. His fists. Something behind his ribs that never fully loosened again. Ambrose had smiled a lot back then. Smiled while he was buying up the water rights one parcel at a time. Smiled while the bank papers got confused, got misfiled, got signed by a man who trusted the wrong lawyer because the wrong lawyer worked for Ambrose, too. Smiled at the funeral when Asa's herd went under from thirst that spring because the creek had been dammed upstream. Legal, they said. All perfectly legal. Asa lost the valley in 9 months. Lost the porch. Lost the mother who didn't survive the winter after. Because grief has its own kind of thirst, too. She'd gone quiet toward the end. Not sick, exactly. Not in any way a doctor could have named and treated, though he'd ridden 2 days to fetch one anyway. Out of the same foolish hope that makes a man reread a letter 40 times. The doctor had listened to her heart and her lungs, and pronounced both sound and had looked at Asa with the particular kind of pity men reserve for other men who haven't yet learned that some things simply can't be doctored. She'd stopped eating first, then stopped talking much, beyond what courtesy required. Then, one gray February morning, she'd simply stopped waking up at all, and Asas had sat beside her bed for the better part of a day before he could make himself go tell anyone, because telling anyone would make it a fact instead of just a private, terrible truth he was still allowed to argue with in his own head. He came up here instead, to rock and pine and thin grass that Ambrose hadn't wanted yet. A handful of winters now. Long enough that talking to a horse had started to feel less like loneliness and more like habit, because the horse at least never smiled while it lied to you. The fire popped, he flinched, which was stupid. A man flinching at his own fire, He looked at the letter again. Ready for hard country. Well, this was hard country. This was the hardest kind there was, the kind that took a man's name, and his water and his mother in the same year, and then made him watch the same sky every single morning, like nothing had happened at all. He thought, not for the first time, of the quilt. Half finished, folded now, in a trunk, at the foot of his cot. Patches of blue and faded rose. His mother had cut from dresses she'd worn thin. She'd meant it for his wedding bed. Someday, she'd said, some good woman, some good year. She hadn't lived to see either. He folded the letter. Third crease now, getting soft at the edges like cloth. Tomorrow he'd ride to town, pay the man at the agency the last of it. And then he'd ride out to the meeting point on the mountain road and wait for a stagecoach, carrying a woman he'd never seen. A gamble. Except it wasn't really a gamble, was it? A gamble implied he had something left to lose. He didn't laugh. He wasn't a man who laughed much anymore. But something moved in his chest that might have been the ghost of one. Company, he told himself. Just company. He almost believed it. He almost always did. Ironwood Creek in the morning looked like most towns did in that part of the territory, which was to say it looked like it was still deciding whether it wanted to exist. One long street. Mud where it wasn't frozen, frozen where it wasn't mud. A saloon that opened too early and closed too late. A church that opened exactly on time and stayed empty most of it. And the agency, tucked between the feed store and a barber who hadn't trimmed a beard shorter than his own patience in years. Matrimonial correspondence, honest arrangements for honest, the sign said, in paint that had started peeling the same week it went up. Asa tied his horse outside the mercantile, first, out of habit more than need, and stood a moment on the boardwalk, looking down the street the way he did every time he came to town, counting what had changed, which was never much. The same tired storefronts, the same dogs asleep in the same doorways. Once this had been a street, he walked with his mother on his arm, buying ribbon for something she never finished either. He didn't let himself linger on that. Lingering never once fixed anything. He remembered her best in this stretch of street, oddly. Not at the porch, not in the sickbed at the end. Here, on a Saturday morning, her gloved hand light on his arm, stopping at every window like the whole street was a museum built just for her opinions. She'd had a way of narrating a town under her breath. That hat is trying too hard. That man owes somebody money. Look at his boots that used to embarrass Asa as a boy, and that he'd have given a year of his life to hear again. Even just once, even just the boring parts. He walked in with the money folded tight in his coat pocket, like it might try to escape. The man behind the desk was small in a way that made his voice sound too big for him. Spectacles. A ledger he guarded like scripture. Mr. Whitlock, the man said, smiling the way men smile when they're paid to. You've made a fine decision. A fine one. Just here to pay, Asa said. Not here for conversation. Not here for the man's opinion on fine decisions. The clerk counted the bills anyway. Slow. Licking his thumb between each one like the money might have bred more. While he wasn't looking. She'll arrive on the Thursday coach, the clerk said. Miss Calavig, all the way from Minnesota. A strong girl, you'll be pleased. Something in the way he said strong. A pause before it. A hitch, small, the kind of hitch a man makes right before he says a word he's been told to use instead of the word he actually means. Asa noticed it. Set it aside the way he set aside everything that didn't sit right, which was most things lately. That all, Asa said. Not really a question. That's all, the clerk said. And then, because men like that never knew when to stop talking, you're a braver man than most, Mr. Whitlock. Marrying sight unseen. Some men couldn't stomach the surprise. Asa didn't answer. He turned for the door. Behind him, low, not quite low enough, two men at the counter of the feed store next door, close enough to hear through the thin wall, close enough that they either forgot he could hear them too, or didn't care. Whitlock's buying himself a wife. Heard she's a big one, real big. Laughter. The kind that isn't really about the joke. The kind that's about needing to laugh at somebody so it isn't you. Man loses a valley, buys a woman instead. World's a strange place. And paused on the door, because for 1/2 of 1 second, he wanted to turn around, wanted to say something that would make the laughing stop. Except that would mean caring what they thought. And he'd spent years training himself not to. So he didn't turn around. He walked out into the cold and untied his horse, and told himself their laughter didn't reach him. It reached him. It always did. He just didn't let it show, which some days was the only victory a man got. He rode past the old bank on his way out of town, the same building where the papers on his valley had changed hands, and didn't look at it, though his horse's ears flicked toward it the way they always did, the way animals remember buildings, the same stubborn way men remember voices. The mountain road out to the stagecoach stop ran along the ridge before it dropped down toward the pass. 2 hours of riding. 2 hours of a man's mind doing what a man's mind does when there's nothing but hoofbeats and wind to fill the silence. What would she look like? He didn't know why he wondered. Didn't much matter, did it? A wife for work, not for wanting. Except the mind doesn't always take orders from the parts of a man that claim to be in charge. He imagined someone tired, someone who'd made the same kind of gamble he had, from the other direction. A woman running from something. Most of them were. He'd heard enough stories, in-town women who answered these advertisements, because home had become a place worse than the unknown. He understood that kind of arithmetic. He'd done the same math himself, in his own way, when he rode up into these hills, and decided rock was better company than memory. Strong girl, the clerk had said. That hitch again. He kept circling back to it, the way a man circles back to a splinter he can't quite dig out. The trail bent. The wind picked up, sharp enough to bite through wool. He thought of Ambrose. Because he always thought of Ambrose eventually, no matter where the thought started. The worst part, if a man was honest with himself, what the losing? It was the liking. Because Asa had liked him, once, had ridden fence lines with him 2 falls running, had shared a bottle the night Ambrose's first calf crop came in strong, had stood up as a witness the day Ambrose signed the papers on his own spread and clapped him on the shoulder like a brother might. Ambrose had a way of making a man feel chosen, singled out, trusted, let in on something that Asa hadn't understood until much later was simply a tool, sharpened and used in carefully on every neighbor up and down the valley who'd eventually lost something to him. He remembered the exact evening the friendliness had started to curdle, though he hadn't recognized it as curdling at the time. A supper at Ambrose's table, candles lit, Ambrose's wife gone now, dead of a fever 2 winters before any of this pouring coffee, and asking after Asa's health with what had seemed then like real warmth. Ambrose leaning back in his chair afterward, cigar unlit between 2 fingers, talking easy about water rights and territorial law, and how a man ought to think ahead, plan for droughts nobody else was planning for. Asa had nodded along, had thought at the time that he was being mentored by a shrewder, older neighbor. He hadn't understood he was being mapped. Every question Ambrose had ever asked him about his herd size, about which parcels he held clear title to, about which bank held his paper, and on what terms had been a survey stake driven quiet into ground, Asa hadn't known was already being measured for someone else's fence. A man could go a long time not seeing a thing like that, could go even longer forgiving himself for not seeing it, once it was too late to matter. He still dreamed about the creek running dry. Still dreamed about his mother's hands, thin by the end, folding a quilt she never finished. Still dreamed about the exact shape of Ambrose's smile at the bank. The day the papers changed hands, like losing everything Asa owned was the finest joke Ambrose had heard all season. A man could carry a thing like that quiet for a long time, until it started to feel less like grief and more like a debt he intended to collect on. Someday, when the moment made itself known, he didn't know a moment was already riding toward him. Overturned in a ditch 2 miles ahead, bleeding into the frost, waiting on a road he hadn't reached yet. He just rode. And the wind kept talking in that voice that owned the ridge. And somewhere past the next bend, something had already gone terribly wrong. He smelled it before he saw it. Blood has a smell all its own in cold air. Copper and something colder underneath. Then the horses. Two of them, down, one clearly dead a while, the other struggling weakly against harness that had pinned it in the wreck. The stagecoach itself lay on its side in the ditch, one wheel still turning slow, in the wind, like it hadn't gotten the news yet that the journey was over. No driver. Asa's stomach dropped before his mind caught up to why. He swung off his horse, fast, faster than he'd moved in months. "Hello!" His voice cracked the quiet in half. "Anybody?" Nothing. He circled the wreck, checked the box, checked beneath the overturned frame. And that's when he saw her, in the brush past the ditch, a shape too large to be anything but wrong for the space it occupied. And for one confused second, his mind tried to make her into a boulder, a fallen log, anything that made sense of her size against the small clearing she'd landed in. Then he saw the dress, torn at the shoulder, blood dried dark along her hairline, more at her collar. He was moving before he decided to move. "Ma'am." His voice lower now, careful. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" She didn't answer. He knelt, and it was only then, close up, that the full size of her registered properly. She was tall, all in a way that made the word tall feel small and insufficient, broad through the shoulder, built, like the land itself had decided to make a person out of granite instead of clay. Even collapsed, even hurt. There was a scale to her that made him understand. Suddenly, exactly what hitch in the clerk's voice had been protecting itself from saying outright. Strong girl. They hadn't lied. They'd just been cowards about the whole truth. He pressed two fingers to her throat, a pulse thready weak, but there. "Alive," he said out loud. To no one, because saying it made it more real. "You're alive." Her breathing rattled shallow. A bruise bloomed dark along her jaw, the shape of it too deliberate to be an accident of the crash. Somebody's knuckles had made that mark. Not a wheel, not a rock. Somebody had hit her. Asa felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. He looked around the wreck again. No driver. No sign of struggle from an animal spooking on the road. The horse's injuries didn't match a simple runaway. This didn't look like an accident that happened. It looked like an accident that had been made. And then he saw it, half buried in frost near her outstretched hand. A folded letter, edges soaked through, the ink bled at the corners but the paper mostly intact. Trampled once a boot print, pressed clean across the fold, like someone had stepped on it and not cared enough to pick it back up. He reached for it, hesitated. This wasn't his to read, except she was unconscious, except there was no driver, no witness, no explanation for a wreck that looked staged instead of accidental, except a man doesn't leave a woman bleeding in a ditch and simply ride on without understanding what he was riding into. He opened it. The handwriting started clean, careful even, the penmanship of someone who'd been taught letters mattered, taught that a woman's hand should never look rushed, even when her heart was. To whoever reads this before he does, Asa's brow furrowed. Before he does. Meaning she'd expected someone might find this first. Meaning she'd written it knowing it might not reach its intended reader whole. "I am Ingrid Kalavig, of Willow Bend, Minnesota. I go to Montana Territory to marry a man I have never met, and I go willingly, though not for the reasons the agency believes." Asa kept reading. The wind tugged at the paper's edge like it wanted to hurry him along. "They call me unmarriageable at home. I am larger than other women, larger than most men, and my family has run out of patience explaining what I am to neighbors who only know how to be afraid of it. There is no shame in what I am, only in how small everyone around me insists on being about it." Something shifted in Asa's chest reading that. He didn't examine it yet. He kept reading. "I chose this path myself. My younger sister Elsa was to be sent in my place sold, if I am honest about the word, to a man twice her age whom our father owed a debt to. I offered myself instead. Not out of nobility. Simply arithmetic. She is 17. I am 27. I have survived worse than a stranger's cabin. She has not yet learned how." Asa's hand tightened on the paper. The next section of the letter changed. The ink darker, pressed harder into the page, like she'd been writing faster, or angrier, or both. The agency man who arranged my passage let slip a name he should not have. A Mr. Garrick Ambrose, financing the matchmaking route through this territory, taking a fee from every match made near a town called Ironwood Creek. He asked, through the clerk, that certain brides be steered toward certain men. I do not know why. I do not know which men. I only know enough to be afraid of the arithmetic, and I have learned to trust arithmetic more than promises. Asa went still. Ambrose. His own hands had gone cold, and it wasn't the wind doing it. If you are reading this, and you are not the man I was promised to please, do not trust the agency's letterhead. There is a second seal pressed faint beneath the first, if you hold the paper to light. I traced it myself the night before I left. A circle with an A inside it. Asa didn't need to hold the letter to the light. He knew the brand already. He'd branded 300 head of cattle with the mirror of that mark once, back when the valley was his and the iron was his, and the world hadn't yet decided to take both away. Circled A. Garrick Ambrose's mark. The agency wasn't just careless. It was owned, and Asa had walked in and handed $100 of his own, hard, bitter, rebuilt money directly into the pocket of the man who'd burned his life to the ground once already. The letter's final lines were shorter, rougher, written, he suspected, in whatever last minutes she'd had before the world went sideways around her. If harm has come to me, know that I did not walk into it blind. I have been watching the men who watch me since the day I left Willow Bend. I am not writing this because I am weak or because I need saving. I am writing this because someone should know the truth, even if I am not there to tell it myself. Ingrid Kalavig Asa sat back on his heels in the frost, letter shaking slightly in his grip. Not from cold, from the sheer cracking weight of understanding two things at once. That the agency he'd trusted was Ambrose's, that the man who'd ruined him once had reached, blind and greedy, straight back into his life without either of them realizing whose hand was moving, whose pieces, and that the woman lying broken in the brush beside him hadn't been some passive cargo shipped west by circumstance. She'd known, some of it, at least. Known enough to plant a warning in her own letter, like a woman leaving breadcrumbs through a forest she suspected was already on fire. He looked at her again. Really looked. Blood at her temple. Bruising that told its own story. A woman built like a mountain, brought down anyway, and still clear-headed enough before the world went dark to leave a trail for whoever found her. Not weak, she'd written. He believed her. Somewhere off to the west, distant but not distant enough, a coyote called, thin and rising. And another answered it further off, and Asa felt the sound land in his chest the way it always did not fear. Exactly, he'd lived up here too long for that. But a plain, practical understanding that blood in open country didn't stay a secret for long. Whatever had happened here, whoever had left her, the wreck wasn't going to wait politely for him to finish deciding what kind of man he wanted to be about it. He couldn't leave her. That was the plain fact underneath every complicated one. Whatever the letter meant, whatever Ambrose's name tangled up in this wreck, meant for Asa's own careful, quiet, hard rebuilt life. None of it changed the plain fact of a woman bleeding in the frost, alone with no driver and no explanation, and no one else on this road but him. All right, he said, mostly to himself, mostly to steady his own hands. All right, he folded the letter, tucked it deep inside his coat against his chest, like it might matter later. It would matter later. He already knew that the way a man knows, weather is turning before the sky admits it. Lifting her wasn't like lifting anyone he'd carried before. She was heavier than most men he'd hauled out of trouble in his life, and there was an awkward, humbling honesty to how much effort it took his knees protesting, his back finding muscles he hadn't used since branding season, a low grunt escaping him that he'd have been embarrassed by if there'd been anyone left to hear it. Except there wasn't. Just wind. Just the dead horse's silence and the living one's labored breath. He got her draped as best he could across his saddle horse's back, which meant walking the whole 2 hours home instead of riding it, which meant leading 2 horses instead of one carrying a stranger who might not survive the trip, through cold that didn't care whose plans it ruined. He didn't complain, not out loud. A man doesn't complain to wind that owns the ridge. It never listens anyway. Somewhere around the first mile, walking, boots crunching frost, his own breath fogging harder than it should from exertion. A thought surfaced that he didn't much want. He'd come out here for company, for a second set of hands, for someone to make the cabin less loud at night. He hadn't planned on carrying a woman home half dead, wrapped in a mystery with Ambrose's fingerprints all over it. Except plans, he was learning again, the way he seemed to keep learning it. Plans were just the story a man told himself before the world told him a different one. Halfway home, the light starting to fail, he found himself talking to her, low, half to keep himself steady, half because the silence out here had a way of pressing in on a man's ears until he filled it with something. "Don't know your voice yet," he said to the still shape draped over the saddle. "Don't know your face proper either, not with all that blood in the way. But I know you wrote a letter with your own murder, maybe already planned against you, and you still thought to leave a trail for a stranger." A pause. Boots crunching. That's not nothing. Wherever you learn to think that clear with your own life on the line, that's not nothing at all. She didn't answer, of course, but something in him settled slightly anyway, the way a man's voice sometimes settles him more than it settles anyone listening. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and tallow, and years of a man living carefully within four walls. He'd never had reason to make it anything other than functional. A cot, a stove, a table, a rifle above the door that he cleaned more out of habit than necessity. He laid her on the cot, the only bed in the place, which meant tonight, and possibly many nights after, the floor would be his. He didn't think about that yet. There wasn't room to think about anything except the next necessary thing. Water first. He heated it, found the cleanest cloth he owned, which wasn't very clean, and did what he could with what he had, wiping the dried blood from her temple. Careful, careful, the way a man is careful with something he's afraid of breaking, even though everything about her suggested she didn't break easy. The bruise at her jaw was worse up close. Deliberate. A fist, and a hard one. Someone had hit her, hard enough to matter, hard enough that whoever it was hadn't been afraid of her size, which told him something too. Something he set alongside the hitch in the clerk's voice and the circled, a pressed faint beneath the agency's letterhead. Whoever had done this either didn't know what she was capable of or didn't care, because they'd had numbers on their side instead. He found herbs he kept for his own wounds. Yarrow, a little willow bark, roots he'd learned to use from a Blackfeet trader years back, who'd taken pity on a fool white rancher who kept cutting himself on his own fence wire. He made a poultice, pressed it gentle against her temple, wrapped her shoulder where the dress had torn and the skin beneath had scraped raw against rock. Hours passed like that. Small tasks, careful hands, the fire cracking low and steady in the stove, throwing orange light across a face he was only now, in the quiet, actually looking at properly. Strong-boned. A jaw that even bruised held its shape with a kind of stubbornness he recognized, because he saw it in the mirror most mornings. Pale hair, the color of dry wheat, escaping its braid in strands that stuck to the blood at her temple until he cleaned that away too. Not what he'd imagined riding out that morning. Not less than what he'd imagined, either. Just entirely, thoroughly, unsettlingly different. Once, near midnight, she stirred without waking a low sound in her throat, her hand twitching like it was reaching for something that wasn't there, a rope or a rail, or somebody's collar. He put his own hand near hers, not quite touching, the way a man gentles a spooked animal without crowding it. "Easy," he murmured. "Whatever it is, it's not here anymore." The twitching stopped. Whether because of him or in spite of him, he couldn't say. He sat by the cot long after there was nothing left to clean or wrap, watching her breathe, waiting. She woke somewhere past midnight. He knew because her breathing changed, first the rattle in it evening out, then catching, then a small sharp inhale of someone surfacing hard and fast from somewhere very dark. Her eyes opened. And Asa watched a version of panic move across her face that he understood immediately because he'd worn it himself once. The panic of waking somewhere unfamiliar and doing the fast, brutal math of whether unfamiliar meant safe or meant worse. She sat up. Too fast. The cot groaned under the shift of her weight, and she winced, hand flying to her ribs, but she didn't lie back down. She braced instead. Ready for what, he didn't know yet, but ready. Easy, Asa said. Hands up open, the way a man gentles a spooked horse. Easy now, you're safe. Her eyes found his. Sharp. Assessing. Not the eyes of someone still half-dazed. The eyes of someone who'd learned a long time ago to wake up fighting first and ask questions after. Where, she said. One word. Rough from disuse. My cabin. Found you on the mountain road. Stagecoach was wrecked. He stopped. Started again. You were hurt bad. She looked down at herself, at the poultice on her shoulder, at the careful wrapping around her ribs. Her hands enormous, capable, the kind of hands that had clearly done real work in a real life. Moved to check the damage herself, methodical, like she didn't fully trust anyone else's report of her own injuries, until she'd confirmed them firsthand. You read my letter, she said, not a question. Asa's jaw tightened. It was on the ground, trampled. You read it, she said again. Flat, final, her eyes hard on his now, and there was something in them that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, but sat somewhere close to both. I did. Silence. The fire popped. Then you know what I am, she said. I know what the letter said, which is that you're stronger than most men give you credit for, that you offered yourself up for your sister, that you knew something about the agency you weren't supposed to know. He paused. That you're not what folks in town were laughing about this morning. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe. She hadn't expected that answer, until it was already out of his mouth. They laughed, she said. They did. At what? At me. Buying a wife. At you being. He stopped himself. Big. She finished for him. Flat again. Like she'd said the word so many times it had worn smooth, lost whatever sting it once carried, become just a fact she'd learned to hold without flinching. I wasn't going to say that, you were going to say it kinder. Doesn't change what the word underneath was. Asa didn't argue, because she wasn't wrong, and he respected people who called things plainly more than people who dressed the truth up to spare his comfort. She shifted again, testing her ribs, testing the strength in her arms, like she was taking inventory of a body that had betrayed her by getting hurt in the first place. You paid $100, she said. Quiet now. Careful in a different way, not fear this time. Something closer to bracing for a blow she expected to land eventually. One way or another. For a wife. For hands. For whatever it is you were told I'd be. I did. I'm not merchandise. Her eyes locked his, unblinking, and there was iron in her voice now. The kind of iron that didn't need volume to carry weight. Whatever they promised you, whatever I owe for the coach, for the wound tending, for the roof, I'll pay it back in work. But I am not something you paid for and now own. If that's what you were expecting when you rode out this morning, you should say so now. Asa was quiet a moment. Let the words settle the way a man lets frost settle, before deciding whether to fight it or work around it. I didn't buy a monster, he said finally. Even. Plain. I bought a hand for the ranch. Someone to split the work with. That's all I was ever expecting, and it's still all I'm expecting now. That's not an answer to what I asked. It's the only answer I've got. She studied him a long moment, something calculating behind her eyes, weighing him the way he imagined she'd learned to weigh every man who'd ever looked at her, sorting threat from harmless, sorting pity from respect, sorting the men worth trusting from the ones who only pretended. There's a man, she said slowly, named Ambrose. In my letter. I know him. Her eyes sharpened further. How? Asa's hand went, without quite meaning it, to his own chest, where the letter still sat folded against his ribs beneath his shirt. He's the reason I don't have a valley anymore, he said. He's the reason I'm up on this ridge instead of down where the grass is good. And near as I can tell, from what you wrote, he's the reason the agency in town took my $100 this morning and put it straight into his pocket without either of us knowing it. The fire cracked again. Neither of them jumped this time. Ingrid was quiet, studying him with an expression that had shifted, not softened, not yet, but shifted, recalculating something. "Then we have the same enemy," she said, slow, like she was testing whether the sentence held weight when spoken aloud. "Looks that way. That doesn't make us friends." Didn't say it did. A long silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind kept talking to the ridge in that voice it always used, the one that owned the place, and always would, no matter who came or went beneath it. "I still intend to pay what I owe," Ingrid said finally. "In work. Nothing more. Fine by me. And I sleep where I choose, not where I'm told. Cot's yours tonight. I'll manage the floor." He paused. "After that, we'll figure the rest out same as everything else out here. One difficult thing at a time." For the first time since she'd woken, something almost like the ghost of amusement crossed her face. Gone as fast as it came, but he saw it. He held on to that the way he held on to the hitch in the clerk's voice, and the circled A beneath the letterhead, and the bruise on her jaw shaped like a man's closed fist. Small things, all of them small things. But a man learns, if he's lived through enough losses, that it's always the small things that end up mattering most in the end. Outside, the wind kept its watch over the ridge. Inside, two strangers sat, in the low orange light of a dying fire, bound together now by $100, a bloodied letter, and the name of a man who had already taken more from both of them than either had yet said out loud. Neither of them slept easy that night. But for the first time in years, Asa Whitlock's cabin didn't feel entirely empty. Down in the valley, past midnight, in a house with more rooms than any one man needed, a lamp still burned in a study where Garrick Ambrose sat reading a telegram about a wrecked stagecoach and a bride who hadn't arrived where she was supposed to. He read it twice, set it down, poured himself 2 fingers of something amber, and didn't drink it right away, just turned the glass slow in the lamplight, thinking. A stagecoach wreck was an inconvenience. Inconveniences, in his experience, were rarely fatal to a plan, only to the people caught inside them. He'd sort it out in the morning. He always did. 3 days. That's how long it took before Ingrid Kalavig tried to stand on her own and nearly put her fist through the cabin wall doing it. Not out of anger. Out of momentum. Because a body that size, once it decides to move, doesn't always ask permission from the ribs still healing underneath it. "Sit," Asa said, from the doorway, arms crossed, trying, and mostly failing, to sound like a man who wasn't worried. "I have sat," Ingrid said, "for 3 days. I am done sitting. Doctor didn't see you. Ribs might. There's no doctor for 2 days' ride, and you know it." She was already up, swaying, just slightly, then not swaying at all, because apparently swaying was also something she'd decided against. "I've broken ribs before, Mr. Whitlock. I know the shape of the pain. This isn't that." He didn't have an answer for that, which annoyed him more than losing an argument usually did. "Fine," he said. "Fine, but you fall. I'm not catching you." Man could throw his back out trying. Something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth, gone fast. But he saw it. "I don't fall," she said. He'd learn over the coming weeks exactly how true that was. The wood pile behind the cabin had a stump beside it that Asa had been avoiding for 2 winters. Oak, old, stubborn, root-bound so deep into the frozen ground that 2 men and a mule hadn't managed to shift it the one time he'd tried. He walked out one morning to find Ingrid standing over it, sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold. A borrowed axe in her hands like it weighed nothing at all. "Don't," he started. Too late. The axe came down. Once. The kind of blow that should have bounced off frozen oak and jarred her shoulder instead. It didn't bounce. It bit deep, clean, a crack running the width of the stump like the wood itself had simply decided arguing. Wasn't worth it. She looked up at him. Not smug. Just matter of fact, the way a person states weather. "Where's the rest of your tools?" she said. "There's a forge back there, gone to rust. Bellows still good, though. Just needs air moving through it again. You know forge work? My father was a smith. Before he wasn't anything. on account of the drink. A pause. Small. Sharp. The way a wound is sharp. Right before it scars over into something a person's learned to live with. I learned before he stopped teaching. Asa looked at her a long moment, reassessing. Because that's what a man does. Again and again it seemed. Around this particular woman, reassess, adjust, reassess again. There's a busted hinge on the barn door, he said. Been busted since fall. Show me. By midday, the forge was breathing again, orange and alive, and Ingrid moved around it like she'd built the thing herself. Which, within an hour, she may as well have she'd rebuilt the bellows joint, cleared years of nesting birds and rust from the flue, and had metal glowing on the anvil before Asa had finished explaining what he needed. He stood at a careful distance, watching, because there was something about her, at that forge, sweat at her hairline. Despite the cold, forearms corded with a strength that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with years of earned skill, hammer coming down in strikes so precise, they barely needed a second attempt that made him forget, for whole stretches of minutes, why he'd been careful with her in the first place. "You're staring," she said, not looking up, hammer never breaking rhythm. "Wasn't staring, you were." "Strike, strike." Men usually stare at me for one of two reasons. Either they're deciding whether to be. To be. Neither, Asa said. And then, because honesty seemed to be the only currency that worked with this woman, was watching you work. That's all. Haven't seen anybody handle a hammer like that, man or woman. She glanced up then. Something in her face he hadn't seen yet, not quite, but something adjacent to it. A door left open a crack, instead of bolted shut. "That's the first true compliment you've given me," she said. "Don't get used to it." "I won't." Strike. But I heard it. He turned to go check the horses. Told himself. That was the whole reason he was walking away. It wasn't, entirely. But it was close enough to true that he let himself believe it. The days took a shape. Not quite comfortable. Not quite easy. But a shape which was more than the ranch had had in years. Ingrid worked mornings at the forge, repairing what needed repairing, sharpening what needed sharpening. And by the second week, Asa found himself with farm tools better than he'd owned since the valley. Afternoons she split wood, or helped with the herd, or once, memorably put her shoulder against a wagon wheel, sunk axle-deep in mud, and simply walked it free while Asa stood there with the reins in his hand and nothing useful coming out of his mouth. "You could help," she'd said, not even breathing hard. "You didn't need help. That's not the point." He hadn't had a good answer for that either. There was a night, early on, when the calving came weeks before it should have. A heifer down in the far pasture, thrashing. The calf turned wrong inside her, and Asa's hands too big and too slow for the work that needed doing. Ingrid was there before he'd finished shouting for her, kneeling in mud and blood without a flicker of hesitation. Her hands, those same enormous, capable hands, going in gentle where his own instinct would have been to force. "Talk to her," Ingrid said, not looking up, focused entire on the animal beneath her hands. Cows calm to voices. "Doesn't matter what you say." Asa talked. Nonsense. Mostly the weather. The state of the fences. His mother's recipe for bread, half remembered, stumbled through in a low, steady murmur while Ingrid worked the calf's legs, straight one at a time, patient as stone, until with a final heave the whole, slick, shuddering mess of a new life slipped free into the cold. They sat afterward in the mud, both of them soaked and exhausted, and grinning like fools, at a newborn calf, finding its legs for the first time. "Where'd you learn that?" Asa asked, breath still ragged. "Same place I learned iron," Ingrid said. "Farm doesn't care if you're a smith's daughter or a rancher's wife. Everything needs the same hands, one way or another." It was the first time he'd heard her say the word wife without flinching at it, and he noticed, and didn't say anything about noticing, and carried it with him for days after like a coin in his pocket he kept forgetting to spend. There was an afternoon, not long after the calving, when Ingrid handed Asa a hammer for the first time and told him to stop watching and start learning. "Every rancher out here should know a little iron," she said, setting a strip of scrap on the anvil orange and glowing and patient. Saves you a 2-day ride to town. Every time a hinge fails or a shoe throws. Never had the patience for it, Asa said. Tried once, years back. Burned my thumb and swore off it. You had a bad teacher. Had no teacher. Just a book and stubbornness. There's your mistake. She positioned his hand on the hammer's grip, adjusting his fingers with the same brisk, unembarrassed efficiency she brought to everything. Iron doesn't care about stubbornness. It cares about rhythm. Hit it like you're angry. It fights you. Hit it steady. It listens. His first strike went wide, glancing off at an angle that sent a spray of sparks toward his boot, and he swore under his breath and stepped back, expecting her to laugh at him the way the men in town might have. She didn't laugh. Again, she said. Simple. Patient. Nobody's born knowing how to listen to metal. Took me years before my father trusted me with anything that mattered. He tried again. Closer. This time, the hammer landing flat instead of glancing. The strip of iron shivering under the blow instead of skittering away from it. Better, Ingrid said. Not good. Better. They worked through the better part of an hour like that. Asa's shoulders aching in a way they hadn't since branding season. Sweat cutting clean lines through the dust on his face, despite the cold outside the forge's small circle of heat. By the end of it, he'd managed something that was, charitably, a crooked but functional hook for hanging tools. Nothing Ingrid would have been proud to sell, but something he'd made himself with his own clumsy, learning hands, under the patient correction of a woman who'd apparently decided, without saying so out loud, that teaching him was worth her time. Not bad, she said, turning the hook over, inspecting the weld with a critical eye that softened, just slightly, at the edges. For a man who swore off it. Had a better teacher this time, Asa said. Something crossed her face then, brief, unguarded, gone before he could name it properly. But he'd snit. And he carried it with him the rest of that day. The same quiet way he carried most things that mattered, close to his chest, unremarked upon, but real. The cot became a problem. Neither of them wanted to name directly, though both of them were tired of dancing around it. Asa on the floor most nights, a bad back waiting to happen. Ingrid on a bed built for someone half her size, knees drawn up, shoulders curled in on themselves, like a woman trying to apologize for the space she took up even in sleep. It was Ingrid, in the end, who said it plain. This is foolish, she said, one evening, nodding at the cot like it had personally offended her. You've got timber enough stacked out back to build a proper room. I've got 2 hands that know their way around a frame as well as an anvil. There's no reason a grown man should be sleeping on his own floor, in his own house, on account of pride. Wasn't pride, Asa said, was manners. Manners that leave you stooped over like an old man by spring. She crossed her arms. I'm not asking you to court me, Asa Whitlock. I'm asking you to let me build a wall. He laughed. Actually laughed, short and surprised. The kind that still caught him off guard when it happened. All right, he said. Build your wall. They worked on it through the better part of a week. Mornings before the forge. Evenings after the herd was settled. A proper second room added onto the cabin's east side. Framed sound, chinked tight against the cold, with a real bed inside it, built to a scale that didn't leave a person curled up small just to fit. Ingrid handled the joinery like she'd been raised to it, which, in a manner of speaking, she had farm work and smith work, both teaching a person the same peely patient respect for how things fit together, how nothing worth building held if it was rushed. Asa found himself, more than once, simply watching her work and forgetting entirely what task he'd meant to be doing himself. Watching the sure economical way she measured twice and cut once. Watching the small furrow that appeared between her brows when a joint didn't sit quite true, and a quiet satisfaction that replaced it once she'd planed it flush. You keep doing that, she said, without looking up. Mid-afternoon on the 3rd day. Doing what? Standing there like I'm the interesting part of the wall. Maybe you are. She did look up then. Something unreadable crossing her face before she covered it with a shake of her head and a return to the work in front of her. But her ears had gone faintly red at the tips. And Asa noticed that too, and carried it alongside everything else he'd started carrying, quiet, without comment. They raised the last wall together on a cold, clear afternoon, the two of them, lifting the heavy frame in tandem, her strength doing most of the work but his hands steady on the angle, guiding it true. It groaned once, settling into the notches they'd cut for it, and then held solid, square, finished. Ingrid stood back to look at it, hands on her hips, breath fogging in the cold. "There," she said, satisfied, plain. "Now nobody's sleeping on a floor that isn't asking to be slept on." "Feels like more than a room," Asa said, quiet, almost surprised at himself for saying it out loud. "It is more than a room," Ingrid said. "It's proof a person can build something out here that isn't taken from somebody else first. That's worth something. Maybe worth more than the room itself." He didn't have an answer smooth enough for that. Didn't try to build one. Just stood beside her in the cold, looking at a wall the two of them had raised with their own four hands, and let the quiet between them say what neither of them was quite ready to say out loud yet. There was a Sunday, somewhere in that second week, when neither of them worked at all. Asa hadn't planned it that way. He'd simply woken to find Ingrid already up, sitting on the cabin step with a mug of coffee gone cold in her hands, watching the light come up pale gold over the ridge, and something about the stillness of her no hammer, no axe, no task gripped tight in those enormous, capable hands had stopped him in the doorway before he could say anything practical about the day's work. "My mother used to make us rest on Sundays," Ingrid said, not turning around. "Whole farm sat idle. My father hated it. Said idle hands cost a man his crop." She said, "A man who never rested cost himself everything else." A pause. "I didn't understand it then. Being young and strong and certain rest was for people too weak to need it. And now? Now I understand. It took her dying for me to understand it," Ingrid said. Simple, unadorned, the kind of grief that had long since stopped needing decoration to be heard. Asa sat down on the step beside her, not touching, just near. "Mine used to read out on the porch," he said. "Whatever book was closest, didn't matter what. Said a mind needed exercise, same as a body, and a porch was as good a gymnasium as any." He looked out at the ridge, at the pines standing patient under a sky, doing nothing in particular. "I used to think that was foolish, too. And now? Now I've got an old book on that shelf I haven't opened in years, on account of it being hers, and every single page in it feeling like a door I wasn't ready to walk through." He said it plain, the way he said most things, but something in his voice caught anyway. Small, quick, gone, before it could become anything worth commenting on. Ingrid didn't push. She simply sat with him, the two of them, idle on a step in the cold morning light, doing absolutely nothing useful at all, and finding, against both their instincts, that the nothing didn't feel like waste. It felt, instead, like something closer to healing, the kind that didn't announce itself, didn't ask permission, just settled in quiet increments, while neither of them was paying close enough attention to stop it. Evenings. They sat by the fire, not close. Careful distance, the kind two wary animals keep between them, even after they've decided the other one probably isn't a threat, but closer than the first night. A little closer every night, in ways neither of them commented on out loud. It was on one of those evenings, maybe the 10th night, maybe the 12th, he'd stopped counting, somewhere around the point where counting had stopped mattering, that she told him the rest of it. "You know part of it," she said. Firelight moving across her face, catching the pale gold of her hair, the healing bruise at her jaw gone from black to a fading yellow-green. From the letter. "Some. Elsa is 17. She said the name like it cost her something every time. Our father owed money. To a man in Willow Bend who called himself a lender, though the word for what he really was is uglier than that." Asa waited. Learned by now that she needed room to get to the hard parts on her own time. "The debt came fast," she said. "Faster than debts usually come. One season we owed nothing. The next, more than the farm was worth, and no clear reckoning of how." Her jaw tightened. "I didn't think much of it at the time. Grief does that. Makes a person stop asking why, and just start asking how to survive the next day. And now? She was quiet a long moment. The fire popped between them. "Now I think the debt wasn't an accident," she said. "Now I think somebody wanted my father owing exactly enough, at exactly the right moment, for exactly the kind of arrangement that gets a strong, unmarried woman shipped west without too many questions asked." Asa's stomach went cold, because he was already 3 steps ahead of her, the way a man gets when he's spent years learning the particular shape of one enemy's handwriting. "Ambrose," he said. "I don't know that." Her voice sharpened, careful, a woman correcting the record even when the record was uncomfortable. "I don't have proof, just arithmetic. And arithmetic that convenient makes me suspicious of every number in it. But if it's true, then my sister was never in danger from a debt at all. She was bait and I was the substitute nobody expected to volunteer. And somewhere between Willow Bend and this cabin, the whole arrangement got sold twice over to men who never once asked what either of us wanted." She looked at him, eyes bright hard, unbroken. "So yes, if it's true, then I didn't just offer myself up for my sister's sake. I offered myself up into exactly the trap I thought I was escaping." Neither of them spoke for a while after that, until Asa said quiet, "You didn't know. Doesn't matter if I knew. Matters to me." She looked at him then, something shifting behind her eyes, some wall recalculating its own height. "Why?" she said. He didn't have a smooth answer. Didn't try to build one. "Because I spent years blaming myself for not seeing what Ambrose was doing to my valley until it was already gone," he said. "Man torments himself over things he couldn't have known. Doesn't help. Never once helped." A pause. "Wasn't gonna sit here and let you do the same thing to yourself? I've been doing to me." The fire cracked. Neither of them jumped. "That's the second true thing you've said to me," Ingrid said, quiet. "Keeping count? Somebody should." She was quiet a while longer, staring into the flame like it had answers. "I write to Elsa when I can," she said, finally. "Careful letters. Nothing that would tell anyone watching where I've landed, or what I know. I don't know if she gets them. I don't know if anybody reads them first." Her hands still, for once, in her lap. "That's the part that keeps me up some nights. Not what happened to me. What might still be happening to her." "We'll find out," Asa said. Simple. No promise dressed up bigger than it could carry. One way or another. We'll find out. It was 3 days after that when they found the creek. Not found exactly. Asa knew the creek, had known it since the day he first staked this land at a thin silver vein running down off the ridge and along the eastern boundary before it dropped toward the valley below, toward what used to be his valley. The same water, technically, that Ambrose had dammed upstream all those years ago. What they hadn't known, what Ingrid noticed, crouched at the bank with the particular attention of someone who'd spent years around metalwork and knew exactly what discoloration in rock and soil was supposed to look like, and what it wasn't was the residue. Asa. Her voice had changed. Flat. Focused. The voice of someone who'd found something and needed him to see it before she said what it was. He crouched beside her, pale crust along the rocks at the waterline. Rust-colored in patches but wrong, somehow. The wrongness of it obvious even to his untrained eye once she pointed at it. "That's not iron," she said. "Iron rusts red-brown, even natural. This is patchy, layered." She rubbed a pinch of it between 2 fingers, careful. The way a person handles something they already suspect is dangerous. "I've seen tailings like this before. Runoff from mining operations, or from tanneries that use certain compounds to cure hide fast and cheap. Enough of it, over enough seasons, and a man's cattle don't die from thirst downstream. They die from what they're drinking," Asa said. Voice gone very quiet. "They die from what they're drinking." They followed the crust upstream that afternoon, further than Asa had walked that creek in years, past the boundary of his own parcel, and onto ground he no longer had any legal claim to. An hour on, tucked into a fold of rock where the water ran fastest, they found the old works, a crude sluice, long abandoned, a scatter of rusted tools half buried in silt, and a stake, weathered but still legible, marked with a surveyor's initials that meant nothing to Asa and everything Ingrid guessed. To whoever had once run tailings down through here in a hurry and never bothered cleaning up after. Somebody used this ground for more than grazing, Ingrid said, turning a corroded pick over in her hands. Small operation. Fast. The kind a man runs quiet, then buries once he's got what he wants out of it. He didn't just starve them, Asa said. Slow. Each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't dam the water and wait for nature to finish the job. Somebody put something in it, Ingrid said. Upstream. Deliberate. Long before it ever reached your herd. Asa's hands curled into fists at his sides. Because years of grief has a certain shape a man learns to carry, learns to live around, learns eventually to almost make peace with. This wasn't that shape anymore. This was rage. Fresh. Sharp-edged. The kind that hadn't had years to dull itself down into something survivable. I need to know who, he said. I need to know for certain. You will, Ingrid said. Standing beside him now, closer than the fireside distance either of them usually kept. But not tonight. Not off a smear of crust on a creek bank and a guess from a blacksmith's daughter. It's more than a guess. It's enough to be dangerous. Not enough to be proof. She looked at him steady. Men like Ambrose don't fall to anger, Asa. They fall to evidence. You go at him with rage alone, he'll bury you the same way he buried you the first time. Careful. Legal. Smiling the whole way through it. Asa looked at her a long moment. The anger didn't leave him, but something else moved in alongside it, a kind of grim, steadying respect for a woman who could stand this close to his oldest wound and still think clearly enough to keep him from bleeding out on it all over again. When did you get so good at strategy? He said. Almost a question. Not quite. When you're built like I am, people either fight you or they scheme-assist you, she said. I got tired of losing to schemers, so I learned to think like one. The surveyor's stake nagged at Asa for 2 more days before he finally rode into town alone to ask about it. The initials carved into the weathered wood, copied careful onto a scrap of paper in his coat pocket. The county recorder was an old man named Holloway, who'd held the position longer than most folks in Ironwood Creek had been alive, and who squinted at Asa's careful copy of the initials for a long moment before setting it down with the particular slowness of a man deciding how much he wanted to say out loud. EP, Holloway said. That'd be Edmund Pruitt. Ran a small placer operation up that fold of rock. Oh, must be 8, 9 years back now. Didn't last a season. Man packed up sudden middle of a night, near as anybody could tell, and nobody thought much of it at the time. Prospectors came and went up here regular in those years. Who financed him? Asa asked. Operation like that, small as you're describing, man doesn't run it on nothing. Holloway's eyes flicked up, sharper than Asa expected, from someone who'd spent 30 years buried in ledgers. Financing records for placer, claims that small don't always make it into county books, Mr. Whitlock. Man wanting to keep his name off, a thing generally finds a way to keep it off. But you remember something. The old man was quiet a moment. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and gave it up as not worth the effort. I remember Pruitt drank at the same table most nights that season, Holloway said finally. And I remember who was buying. He didn't say the name. Didn't need to. Some things in a small town got said just as clear by what a man left out as by what he put in. Asa rode back up the ridge that evening, with one more thread pulled tight, one more piece of the shape he'd spent years half seeing finally locking into place. It wasn't proof enough for a courtroom, not yet. But it was enough to know, with a certainty that settled cold and clean in his chest, that water hadn't poisoned itself, and that the man who'd poisoned it had been careful, the way Ambrose was always careful to keep his own hands looking clean the whole while. He told Ingrid everything. That night, the two of them bent over the crude map again, adding Pruitt's initials to the corner of it, like another nail driven into a case that was, slowly, methodically, becoming impossible to argue away. A man that careful doesn't leave much, Ingrid said, studying the addition. But careful men make one mistake, eventually. They start believing their own carefulness makes them untouchable. That's usually where they slip. Hope you're right. I generally am, she said. And for the first time in longer than either of them could easily name, there was something almost like a real smile behind the words, tired, worn thin at the edges by weeks of grief and reckoning, but real all the same. The rider came 4 days later, mid-morning, dust still hanging behind him on the trail, a lean young man on a horse too fresh to have come far, though he claimed otherwise. 22, maybe 23, with the kind of face that hadn't decided yet what kind of man it wanted to grow into, not unkind, exactly, but unsettled, the way a man looks when he's carrying something he hasn't made peace with. He kept glancing back down the trail he'd come up, quick, involuntary, the way a man glances when he's not entirely sure nobody followed him. "Name's Tom," he said. Atlo nodded his eyes, in a way that struck Asa as either shyness or something closer to caution. "Ride for one of the small outfits south of here. Heard you're the fella been asking questions about Ambrose's water rights?" Asa hadn't asked those questions out loud to anyone, not once, which was the first thing that didn't sit right, though he let it pass for the moment, set it alongside all the other things that didn't sit right lately. "What of it?" Asa said. "Ambrose is planning something. Soon. Word is he's moving men up toward the ridge road 2 nights from now, aiming to push you off this Foss parcel, same way he pushed you off the last one." Tom's eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the cabin, toward the shape of Ingrid standing in the doorway. "Man like that don't like unfinished business. And you're about as unfinished as business gets, far as he's concerned." "Why tell me?" Asa said. "Not everybody who rides for Ambrose does it happy," Tom said. "Some of us got no love for a man who poisons water and calls it commerce." A pause, and here Asa felt the first small, cold prickle of wrongness sharpen into something more specific, because he hadn't mentioned poison, hadn't said the word out loud to a single living soul outside this cabin. "Best thing you can do is move your herd east 2 nights from now. Clear off the ridge road entire. Let his men find empty ground when they come. No fight, no bloodshed, no reason for it to go further than a wasted trip for Ambrose's boys." Asa nodded slow, thanked him, watched him ride off down the trail, dust rising behind a horse that still looked far too fresh for a story about riding hard from the south. He turned back toward the cabin. Ingrid was already watching him, with an expression he was starting to recognize, the look of a woman, doing arithmetic in her head and not liking the sum. "He knew," Asa said, before she could speak. "About the poison. I never said that word to anybody but you, I noticed. And there's more that doesn't sit right about him than just the word he shouldn't have known." Ingrid crossed her arms, eyes still on the settling dust. "A man who rides for a small outfit south of here doesn't wear boots that clean, doesn't sit a horse that fresh after 2 hours on a hard trail. And he never once told you the outfit's name, which is a strange thing to leave out, if it's true." Asa went very still. "You think it's a trap, I think," Ingrid said slowly, "that a kind warning delivered by a stranger at exactly the moment you're most desperate for one is the oldest trick there is. My father used a version of it once, back when he still had a trade and a temper both. Tell a man where the danger isn't, and he'll walk himself straight into where it is." Asa's mind moved fast now, turning the pieces, the way it hadn't quite let itself move in years of simply enduring, instead of fighting back. "If I move the herd east, off the ridge road, then the ridge road sits open, undefended. And whatever Ambrose actually intends to do 2 nights from now happens exactly where you aren't standing to stop it." Ingrid's eyes were hard now, sharp, the eyes of a woman who'd spent a lifetime learning to see the trap before it closed. "Or it happens exactly where you are standing, alone, without your herd around to make noise or witnesses to make trouble. Either way." "Huh. Somebody wanted you moving, Asa. That should worry you more than anything," Tom said out loud. Asa looked toward the ridge road, toward the empty trail Tom's dust had already settled back down onto, like the rider had never been there at all. He'd been careful a long time, kept his head down, licked his wounds, told himself the valley was a closed chapter, and the ridge was simply where a beaten man went to be forgotten. He wasn't feeling beaten anymore. 2 nights, he said quiet, testing the shape of the words. We've got 2 nights to figure out what he's really planning, and 2 nights to decide whether we're running from it or standing in the middle of it and making him regret ever sending a boy up here with clean boots and a story that didn't hold water. Ingrid stepped up beside him, close enough now that their shoulders nearly touched, close enough that the careful fireside distance from weeks ago felt like it belonged to two entirely different people. I didn't come 2,000 miles to run from anybody, she said. Least of all, a man who poisons water and buys women through the mail like they're seed catalogs. Despite everything, the cold prickle of the trap closing in, the rage still simmering under years of careful grief. The 2 days now hanging over both their heads, like weather that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to break. Asa felt something tug at the corner of his mouth, almost a smile. The first real one in longer than he cared to admit. Careful, he said. Starting to sound like you're on my side of this. Ingrid glanced at him, something unshaken in her eyes, the kind of certainty that didn't ask permission from anybody. I'm on my own side, she said. Turns out, right now, that happens to be the same side as yours. He'd take it. For a man who'd spent years with nothing standing beside him, but a tired horse and a ridge that never once talked back kindly, he'd take it. That same night, past midnight, Asa woke to the sound of the horses stamping uneasy in the barn. Not the ordinary shuffle of animals settling, but something sharper, more alert. The particular restlessness horses got when something moved nearby that shouldn't have. He was up and reaching for the rifle before he'd fully thought it through, and found Ingrid already awake, behind him, already dressed, moving quiet toward the window, with the crude economy of someone who didn't waste motion, even half asleep. There, she said, low, pointing toward the tree line at the edge of the pasture, where a shape a rider, still, watching, not moving toward the cabin, sat motionless against the dark for the space of maybe 10 seconds before turning and melting back into the pines. Scouting, Asa said. Quiet, certain. Scouting, Ingrid agreed. Which means whatever Tom told you about 2 nights from now, somebody's already deciding how much of it they believe. They didn't sleep much the rest of that night, taking turns at the window, watching a tree line that stayed empty and dark and gave up no further secrets. But something had shifted between them by morning, a shared, wordless understanding that the danger wasn't hypothetical anymore, wasn't just careful arithmetic scratched onto a scrap of hide. It was close. It was watching. And it was patient in exactly the way a man like Garrick Ambrose could afford to be patient when he believed, as he always had, that time and money would eventually deliver him whatever he wanted. They went into town together the next morning. Supplies, Asa said, though they both knew it was more than that. A chance to see what the Ridgewood looked like from below before the storm of the next 2 nights. A chance to gauge how much of what Tom had said had already reached other ears in Ironwood Creek. The street looked the same as it always did, mud and frost and the same tired storefronts. But the eyes on it were different this time, and Asa felt it the moment they tied up outside the mercantile, heads turning, not with the same lazy cruelty as before, but with something closer to open curiosity, a few even with something that looked, grudgingly, like respect. That's her, someone murmured. Not quite low enough, the same way the 2 men outside the feed store hadn't been quite low enough weeks before. The big one. Heard. She put a wagon wheel back on its axles with her bare hands. Heard she's rebuilt half of Whitlock's tools. Better than the smith we had before he left. Ingrid's jaw was tight, walking beside him, but there was no flinch in it this time. No bracing for a blow. Just a woman letting the words pass over her like weather, the way Asa himself had learned to, out of necessity, years ago. Inside the mercantile, the owner, a stooped, careful man named Peterson, who'd known Asa's mother, nodded at Ingrid. With something almost formal. Heard good things, Peterson said. Simple. No mockery in it at all. Man came through last week, said you fixed a plowshare nobody else in 3 counties could manage. Said it held better than new. It was a fair repair, Ingrid said. Nothing more. Wasn't nothing to him. Peterson glanced at Asa, something knowing in the look. Man's lucky, is what I'd say. Whatever anybody in this town laughed about back in the fall. Asa didn't say anything to that. Didn't need to. He caught Ingrid's eye instead, and there was something passing between them that hadn't been there the first time they'd walked this street. Not affection exactly. Not yet, or not named as such, but something steady building underneath it, brick by brick, the way trust always built itself when nobody was rushing it. They were loading the last of the flour sacks onto the wagon when the trouble found them. Yes. Two riders, Ambrose men, unmistakable by the way, they sat their horses that same borrowed confidence, the kind a man wears when he knows the fists behind him outnumber the ones in front. Asa recognized the taller one from a cattle sale years back, a foreman named Dade, who'd once made a point of not shaking Asa's offered hand. Whitlock. Dade didn't dismount. Didn't need to, not with two of them and one of Asa. Heard you and you're a pause. Deliberate, ugly. Your purchase there been asking around about old mining stakes. Heard you been up past your own boundary line, poking at ground that isn't yours to poke at. Ground's not yours either, Asa said. Even. Not anymore. If the deed's what I think it is. Deed's whatever Mr. Ambrose says it is. Dade's eyes slid over to Ingrid. Slow, deliberately insulting in the way they traveled. Big as she is, surprised she's got room left in that skull for other people's business. The street had gone quiet around them, the particular quiet of a town, deciding whether to watch or look away. Ingrid didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. I've got room enough to remember faces, she said. And to remember which ones ride up ridge roads asking, after poison, nobody's supposed to know the word for. Something flickered across Dade's face, quick, involuntary, the same kind of tell Tom had given away without meaning to, days before. He recovered fast, but not fast enough. You want to watch that mouth, Dade said. Big or small, a woman's mouth can still get her hurt out here. Asa's hand didn't move toward the rifle in the wagon bed. Didn't need to, not yet. But something in his stance shifted, weight settling forward onto the balls of his feet. The old careful stillness of a man who'd learned, the hard way, exactly how fast trouble could turn from words into something worse. You threatening her in the middle of a street full of witnesses, Asa said. Quiet. Almost curious. In front of a mercantile owner who's known my family 30 years. That the kind of arithmetic Ambrose taught you? Or did you work that one out on your own? Dade's jaw tightened. For a moment nobody moved. The whole street balanced on the thin edge of a thing that could still go either way. Then Peterson's voice, dry, unbothered, carrying from the mercantile doorway where he'd come to stand with his arms crossed, and absolutely no fear in his posture at all. Awful lot of men gathered outside my store, not buying anything, Peterson said. Either you're here for flour, or you're not welcome to loiter. Sheriff's office is 2 doors down, in case anybody's forgotten. It wasn't much. A shopkeeper's dry warning, nothing more. But it was enough witnesses, enough daylight, enough of a town watching for Dade to decide the arithmetic wasn't worth it. He spat once, deliberate, into the mud near the wagon wheel, and reined his horse around. Tell your woman to mind her mouth, he said over his shoulder, to Asa, and tell yourself the same, while you're at it. Mr. Ambrose's patience isn't what it used to be. They rode off unhurried, the way men do when they want to leave the impression that leaving was their idea all along. Ingrid let out a breath once they'd gone, slow, controlled, the kind of breath a person lets go only once they've decided it's safe to. You're shaking, Asa said, not unkind, just noticing. I'm not scared of him, Ingrid said. I'm angry. There's a difference. And my hands haven't quite worked out which one they're supposed to be doing yet. Both, probably. At the same time, man learns to let them share space. Eventually, she looked at him, something wry pulling at the corner of her mouth, despite everything. That's supposed to be comforting. Wasn't trying for comforting. Was trying for true. Keep at it, she said. You're getting better at it than you think. They rode back up toward the ridge as the light started to fail. Saddlebags heavier, the 2 days ticking down toward whatever the storm gathering on the horizon was going to bring with it. That night, they didn't sit at their usual careful distance by the fire. They sat close, a map of the ridge sketched, crude in charcoal, on a scrap of hide between them, working out lines of sight and fallback ground, and every version of what the coming nights might bring. Ingrid's shoulder against his more than once as she leaned to mark a position, and neither of them moved away from it the way they might have. Weeks earlier, when careful distance was still the only distance either of them trusted. There, she said, marking a rise above the ridge road. High ground. If men come up that trail in the dark, whoever holds this rise sees them a full quarter-mile before they see anyone below. You've done this before, Asa said. Not quite a question. I've defended a forge from men who didn't like a woman working iron better than they could, she said. Simply. Grounds different. Principles the same. Know your high point. Know your escape. Don't ever let the other man choose both for you. Asa studied the map. Studied her, briefly, in the firelight. The sharp focus in her face. The healing bruise at her jaw. Finally faded to nothing more than memory. The capable hands that had rebuilt his forge and split his stubborn oak stump, and were now, quietly, without either of them quite naming it, helping rebuild something else in him too. Something he'd thought Ambrose had taken from him for good, years back, along with the valley and the water, and his mother's unfinished quilt. Not hope, exactly. Something plainer than that. Something closer to purpose. 2 nights, he said again. Quieter this time. Less a countdown. More a promise. 2 nights, Ingrid agreed. Outside, the wind kept its long watch over the ridge. Same as it always had, same as it always would. But for the first time in longer than Asa Whitlock could remember, the wind wasn't the only standing watch anymore. Down in the valley that same night, Garrick Ambrose stood at his study window, watching the storm clouds already starting to gather over the peaks, a full 2 days early by his own reckoning, and felt something he rarely let himself feel. Not doubt, exactly. He'd built too much of his life on never once entertaining doubt, but something adjacent to it, a small unfamiliar itch at the back of his mind, the sense of a plan that had, somewhere in its careful architecture, developed a crack he couldn't quite locate. He told himself it was nothing. He was usually right about such things. He wasn't this time. The sky turned the color of a bruise the very next evening, 1 full night sooner than the 2 Tom had promised. The storm rolling in fast and mean off the peaks, like it had somewhere urgent to be, which felt, Asa thought, about right, because nothing about the last weeks had asked permission to be subtle, and neither, apparently, would this. Wind first. Then the temperature, dropping so fast his ears popped with it. Then clouds stacking up over the ridge in a way that meant one thing to any man who'd spent a life, reading Montana weather. Storm coming. A real one. And a full night early. Tonight, Ingrid said. Standing in the cabin doorway, watching the sky do what it was doing. Not tomorrow like Tom said. Tonight. Storm gives them cover a day sooner than planned, and a man like Ambrose takes an early gift when the weather hands him one. You sound certain. I am certain. She turned to look at him, and there was something steady in her face that hadn't been there the first week, something that had been building slow and quiet the whole time neither of them had been naming it. Because it's exactly what I'd do, if I were him. Asa checked the rifle above the door. Checked it again, though it hadn't changed in the 10 seconds since the first check. His hands wanted something to do that wasn't just waiting. You don't have to be here for this, he said. Quiet. Not quite looking at her. Whatever's coming tonight, it's my fight. Started before you ever got on that stagecoach. Ingrid crossed the room. Stood close enough that he had to look up, just slightly, the way he'd gotten used to doing around her without it bothering him the way it might have once. It stopped being only your fight the day a man poisoned water. I now know the name of, she said. It stopped being only your fight the day I found out. My own family got sold into the same scheme that took your valley. Her jaw set, hard, unbroken. This is my fight too, Asa Whitlock. Has been since. Before I woke up on that cot with you standing over me, like you weren't sure whether to trust me. Wasn't sure, I know. The faintest ghost of a smile. Gone as fast as it came. You're sure now? It wasn't a question. He didn't answer it. Like one, I'm hush now, he said. They worked until dark. Ingrid at the forge, one final time, hammering out 3 crude but serviceable spikes to jam beneath the barn door, reinforcing the hinge she'd already fixed once. Asa checking the high ground she'd marked on the map, walking the rise above the ridge road until he knew every rock and root on it blind, and riding out besides to 2 of the nearest small ranches, the same men who'd come forward weeks later with their own herd losses to warn them the storm might bring more than weather with it. Neither outfit had much to offer in the way of guns or men on short notice, but both promised to keep lanterns burning and ears open, which in country like this counted for something. By the time full dark came down, the storm had arrived with it. Rain first, hard and cold then. Something colder underneath the rain that meant snow wasn't far behind. Thunder rolled somewhere back over the peaks, distant still, but coming. They sat at their fire one last time before it started, not at careful distance, not even close to it. If something happened to me tonight, Asa said, low, not looking at her, looking at the fire instead, the way a man looks at something that doesn't ask hard questions back. There's a strong box under the floor. Deed to this parcel. What money I've got. It's yours, no arguments. Nothing's happening to you tonight. Ingrid, nothing, she said again. Firmer, is happening to you tonight. I didn't rebuild your forge and split your ugly stump and walk 2,000 miles into a family's worth of trouble just to bury you before winter's even properly started. Her voice cracked, just slightly. At the very end of it, the first crack he'd heard in it since the night she woke up hard and fighting on that cot. He looked at her then, really looked. Firelight catching every hard, capable, unbreakable line of her, and underneath all of it, something soft that she guarded the way she guarded everything careful, quiet, only let loose when the alternative was worse. Okay, he said. Simple. Okay, nothing's happening to either of us tonight. Say it like you believe it. Working on it. She almost laughed. The sound got swallowed by a crack of thunder, closer now, and both of them went still, listening past it for the sound underneath it that mattered more. Hoofbeats. Several. Coming up the ridge road. Fast, the storm doing exactly what she'd said it would, hiding them until they were close enough that hiding stopped mattering. Asa was on his feet before the sound had even fully registered. They're here, Ingrid said. Already moving toward the door, already reaching for the crude iron spike she'd forged, with her own hands not 6 hours earlier. Ingrid, high ground, she said, not slowing. I know the plan same as you do. Go. The rise above the ridge road gave Asa a clear line down onto the trail, rain sheeting sideways in the wind hard enough to sting. He counted lantern light through the storm 4 riders, maybe 5, hard to tell, with the rain and turn everything into smears of dark and wet and moving shadow. Woman. At the front, unmistakable even through the storm, sat a man who didn't ride like someone worried about weather. Sat his horse easy, confident. A man who'd never once in his life had to consider that a plan might not simply unfold the way he'd designed it. Garrick Ambrose. Asa's hand tightened on the rifle, because years of grief has a shape, and rage has a different one entirely, and both of them were fighting for space in his chest right now, with the man who had caused both of them sitting less than 60 yards downhill. He didn't fire. Not yet. Ingrid's voice from days back, steady in his memory. Men like Ambrose don't fall to anger. They fall to evidence. Go at him with rage alone. He'll bury you the same way he buried you the first time. He held. The riders reached the cabin. Ambrose's voice carried up through the storm, amplified by whatever satisfaction a man feels when he believes he's already won. Whitlock, I know you're up there somewhere, playing hero on a ridge that isn't worth the frost on it. A pause. The horses shifting, restless in the storm. I only came for the woman. She was never legally yours to begin, with the arrangement your agency drew up, never had proper authority behind it, and I intend to see that corrected. Send her out. Nobody else needs to get hurt over $100 and a mistake. Asa's jaw tightened. except the cabin door was already open. Ingrid stood in the frame, rain lashing sideways past her, tall and unbowed, and utterly unafraid, in a way that made even Ambrose's horse shift uneasy beneath him. "I'm not property," she said, her voice carrying clean through the storm, cutting through thunder itself. "And you didn't come for me. You came because Asa Whitlock found out what you did to his water years ago, and you can't afford for that particular truth to reach a courthouse." Ambrose's easy confidence flickered, just slightly, just enough that Asa, watching from the rise, marked it and held it close. "Careful, girl," Ambrose said, voice gone harder now. "Big as you are, there's more of us than there is of you." "There's more of you," Ingrid agreed. "There's also less of you that I need conscious to prove what I already know." She moved fast, faster than a woman her size had any right to move, closing the distance before Ambrose's men had fully processed she was doing it. And for one wild, stormlit second, Asa watched her put a grown man on the ground with a single shoulder-driven blow that would have dropped a mule. Then the numbers caught up to her. Two more riders closed in, rope thick and cruel, thrown fast, and even Ingrid's strength had limits against three men working in concert against. One Asa watched, heart slamming as they wrestled her down, wrists bound behind her, hauled up rough onto Ambrose's own horse, in front of him, like a trophy he'd finally, after everything, managed to claim. Now Ambrose called up toward the ridge, voice carrying triumphant through the rain. "Come down off that rock, Whitlock, or I ride out of here with something that belongs to me. Your choice how this ends." Asa came down, not because he'd lost the high ground, because some choices aren't really choices at all. Not when the alternative means watching someone you've come to. He didn't finish that thought, didn't let himself finish it. Not yet. Not with a rifle in his hands and a decision to make in the next 60 seconds. That sad. Would decide whether he still had a life worth finishing thoughts in at all. He walked into the clearing below, rifle lowered but not dropped, rain running cold down the back of his collar. "There he is," Ambrose said, smiling. The same smile from years ago, the one that had watched a valley die and called it commerce. Reasonable, in the end. "I always said you were a reasonable man, Whitlock, whatever else people said about you in town." "Let her go." "When you hand over that letter," Ambrose said, "the one with my mark under the agency's seal, I know she read it to you. I know you've been sitting on it like it's a weapon, which, credit where it's due, it very nearly is." His smile sharpened. "Hand it over. Hand over whatever nonsense you two dug up at that creek besides. And maybe, I ride out of here satisfied enough to leave the rest of this alone." Asa's hands were steady. His voice wasn't, not entirely, but steady enough. "And if I don't, then we find out how much that $100 really meant to you," Ambrose said, glancing back, almost casual, at Ingrid, bound and furious atop his horse. "Because it'd be a shame. Woman built like that. Strong as an ox and twice as stubborn. Rope's not going to hold something like her forever. But I imagine we can find something that will, given time." Something in Asa went very cold and very clear all at once. "You poisoned my water," he said. Quiet. The rain nearly swallowing it, but Ambrose heard. Asa watched him hear it. "Didn't just dam the creek and let nature finish what greed started. You put something in it. Something that killed my herd slow enough to look natural and fast enough to finish jump before I understood what was happening." Ambrose's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "Careful with accusations you can't prove," he said. "I've got a smear of residue off the creek bank," Asa said. "I've got old works buried a mile upstream that nobody's touched in years, but somebody was in an awful hurry to walk away from. I've got a letter with your mark pressed under an agency seal that shouldn't have your mark anywhere near it. I've got a writer who knew a word I never said out loud to anyone, but the woman you've currently got tied to your saddle." His voice was rising now, the storm and the rage both feeding into it. "I don't need a courtroom to know what you did, Ambrose. I've known the shape of it for years. I just finally found the proof to put beside the shape." Up on the horse, hands bound, rain plastering her hair flat against her skull, Ingrid went suddenly, deliberately still. Asa saw it, recognized it, The way a man recognizes the specific quiet a predator goes still with, right before it moves. She'd found something to work with. What Ambrose hadn't accounted for, what none of his men had bothered to check. Too satisfied with the rope alone, too confident in the simple arithmetic of numbers against one woman, was the small iron file Ingrid Kalavig had tucked into her boot before she'd ever walked out that cabin door. A blacksmith's habit: always carry something that can cut, even when everyone around you, some or only weapon is your size. She'd been working the rope loose since the moment they'd hauled her up. Slow, patient. The particular patience of someone who understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how metal and fiber both eventually gave way to steady, deliberate pressure. The rope parted just as Ambrose opened his mouth to answer Asa's accusation. She didn't wait for an opening. She made one. Both bound wrists freed now, though Ambrose hadn't noticed yet. Too focused on the man in front of him, came up and back in a single motion, driving an elbow into Ambrose's ribs with enough force that Asa heard the crack of it even over the storm. Ambrose went sideways off his own horse, hitting mud hard, the wind driven clean out of him. "I told you," Ingrid said, dropping down off the horse herself, rope trailing loose from wrists that had never needed it in the first place. Not really, not once she'd decided otherwise. "I'm not property. And property doesn't get to decide when it's finally had enough." Ambrose's men surged forward, two of them, rifles coming up, and for one suspended, storm-lit second, the whole clearing held its breath. Until a third rider, the lean young one, hat low, boots that had always been too clean for the story he'd told, swung down off his own horse instead of raising a weapon. "Enough," Tom said loud, firm. Something in his voice cracking open that hadn't been there on the trail 2 days back. "This wasn't you told me. This was about moving cattle. Nobody said anything about poison. Nobody said anything about tying up a woman half to death in a storm." Ambrose, still down in the mud, ribs cracked, looked up at his own rider with something between fury and disbelief. "You work for me," he snarled. "Not that fella south of here you had me lie about," Tom said. "There's no small outfit. Never was. You had me ride up here with a story built to move him off this ground so your men could catch him with nothing behind him. I did it because you pay well, and I needed the money more than I needed my conscience. Not anymore." And then to Asa, quieter, "I can testify. About the water. About what he told me to say up on that ridge road. I've got nothing left to lose by it now, anyway. Man like Ambrose doesn't forgive being crossed, whether I help you or not." Asa looked at him, at Ingrid standing free and furious and utterly unbroken in the rain, at Ambrose down in the mud where years of grief had finally, after everything, managed to put him. He raised the rifle, aimed it square at the man who'd taken everything from him. Once already, his finger found the trigger. Years of it. Years of a mother's unfinished quilt, and a valley gone to dust, and a name that used to mean something in a town that had forgotten it ever did. All of it compressed down into this single, rain-soaked, thunder-cracked moment, with the man responsible for so much of it lying helpless in the mud in front of him. Nobody would blame him. Not really. Not out here, not with a storm loud enough to swallow a gunshot and a man like Ambrose who'd earned every bit of what was coming to him 10 times over. Asa's hand was steady, until it wasn't. Until Ingrid's voice cut through the rain. Quiet, not pleading, not commanding, just true. The way everything she said to him always managed to be true, whether he wanted to hear it or not. Asa. Just his name. Nothing more. He didn't lower the rifle. Not yet. But something in him, the part that had spent years, being careful, being quiet, being a man who endured, instead of a man who acted that part, finally fully caught up to the part of him that had already decided what kind of man he wanted to be standing on the other side of tonight. "If I pull this trigger," he said, voice rough, barely audible over the storm, "I become exactly what he is. A man who decides other people's fates because he's got power to. Because nobody's there to stop him." "You'd be right to hate him," Ingrid said, stepping closer, careful, not touching him, just close enough that he could feel her there beside him, the way he'd felt her there beside him at the fire, At the forge, at the map spread out between them days back. Nobody would blame you for it. But, but that $100 you paid, she said. Quiet now. It wasn't for a killer. It wasn't even really for a wife, not at first. It was for a man who wanted something better than what years of grief had left him. I've watched you become that man, a little. More, every single day since I woke up on your cot. Her eyes held his, unshaken, the same certainty that had carried her 2,000 miles into a trap she'd walked into with her eyes open. Don't let him take that from you, too. He's taken enough already. Asa held the rifle a moment longer. Then slow, deliberate, he lowered it. Get up, he said to Ambrose, voice flat, final. You're going to stand trial for what you did to that water, for what you did to Ingrid's family, for every valley you've stolen out from under a man too honest to see it coming. He looked to Tom, and you're going to help make sure the evidence holds. Tom nodded. Slow. Something like relief moving across his rain-soaked face. Ambrose, still in the mud, still cradling cracked ribs, stared up at Asa with an expression that had finally, for the first time, in this whole long story, lost its smile completely. You'll regret this, he said, voice thin now, desperate in a way it had never once been before tonight. Mercy's a weakness, Whitlock. Always has been. Maybe, Asa said, but it's mine. And you never once managed to take that from me, whatever else you took. They waited out the last of the storm in the cabin. Ambrose bound now with his own men's rope in the corner by the cold stove. Tom, keeping watch over him with a rifle he held, like a man, still deciding whether he trusted himself with it. Ingrid sat on the edge of the cot while Asa checked her wrists, where the rope had bitten in before she'd worked herself free. Careful, quiet. The same careful quiet he'd used on her that very first night, tending wounds by firelight with hands that had learned, somewhere in the weeks between then and now, exactly how much pressure a person like her could take and exactly how much was simply too much to ask. You're shaking, Ingrid said. Not unkind. Just observing. Been a long night. That's not shaking from cold. He didn't argue with her. Didn't have the energy left to pretend otherwise. His hands, wrapping a strip of clean cloth around her wrist, trembled with the particular aftershock of a man who'd held a rifle on another man's life, and chosen, at the very last possible second, not to end it. I keep seeing it, he said. Quiet, the moment before I lowered it. How close I came to being no different from him. But you were different, Ingrid said. That's the whole of it, Asa. Not that you weren't tempted. Anybody would have been tempted. It's what a man does with the temptation that tells you who he actually is. He looked up at her then, rain still ticking soft against the roof outside, the fire down to embers. Ambrose muttering something bitter and ignored in the corner. Wouldn't have gotten there without you, he said. No, Ingrid agreed. Simple. Not false, modest about it. You wouldn't have, but you're the one who lowered it. That part was you, and only you, and no letter or forge work or anything else I brought up this mountain gets to take credit for that. The storm broke sometime before dawn, the way storms in that country always eventually did, leaving behind a sky scrubbed raw and clean and cold. Ambrose rode back to town under guard Tom's testimony, the creek residue, the abandoned works upstream, and the letter with its telltale seal enough, in the end, to see him locked away pending trial, his fortune and his water rights both tied up in a legal reckoning that would take months to fully unwind but had, at last, finally begun. The trial itself, when it came, was shorter than anyone expected and longer than Asa's patience wanted. He sat through most of it beside Ingrid, watching 6 years no, longer than that, watching a whole stretch of a life he'd once assumed was simply his lot to carry, get laid out plain in front of a judge and a courtroom full of neighbors who'd spent years assuming the tired story about a man who'd lost his valley to bad luck and worse debt. Tom testified second, after the territorial surveyor confirmed. The abandoned works matched no legal claim on record. He kept his hat in his lap the whole time, turning it slow between his hands, and didn't look at Ambrose once while he spoke. He told me exactly what to say, Tom said, when the prosecutor asked him to describe the Ridge Road conversation. Told me to make up like a friend, doing a favor. Told me if Whitlock moved his herd east, his men would have a clear run at the cabin, with nobody around to make noise about it. And you agreed to this. I agreed to it because he paid better than anybody else in 3 counties, and because a man learns not to ask too many questions about where the money comes from when he's hungry enough. Tom's voice caught just slightly. I'm not proud of it, but I'm here telling the truth about it now, which is more than anybody made me do. Ingrid testified after him, steady through every question, describing the creek residue in the same plain, unadorned language she'd used that first afternoon at the water's edge, until even jurors who'd never once questioned Ambrose's word in their lives found themselves leaning forward, listening close. Watching that story get corrected, line by line, felt less like triumph and more like something being set down that Asa hadn't realized, until the weight lifted, quite how heavy it had been. The valley's water ran clear again, within the week after the verdict. Once the dam came down, under a court order nobody in town had the stomach to argue with, not after Ingrid's testimony about the residue, not after half a dozen small ranchers came forward with herd losses of their own that had never quite added up until now. Asa didn't get his old valley back. Some things, once lost, stay lost, and he'd made a kind of peace with that, a long time before any of this started. But he got something else instead. Word of the trial's outcome traveled through Ironwood Creek faster than any single piece of gossip Asa could remember in years. And it brought with it something he hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with at first neighbors. Real ones. Men who'd laughed outside the feed store, months back showing up unannounced one Saturday morning with lumber and tools and wives bearing baskets of food because the storm had done real damage to the barn roof, and a community that had spent years pretending not to notice Asa Whitlock existed had apparently decided all at once that pretending wasn't going to serve them anymore. Peterson was there, directing the lumber like he'd appointed himself foreman, which nobody argued. Holloway came too, older than the work probably called for, but insisting on holding boards steady anyway, muttering about surveyors' stakes and careful men the whole, while like it was a private joke, only he found how funny. Ingrid worked the forge that day harder than Asa had ever seen her work it, turning out hinges and bracket and nails fast enough to keep 6 men supplied, and more than once caught sight of her actually laughing, unguarded, head thrown back at some joke one of the ranch wives had made. The same women who might, a season earlier, have crossed the street rather than stand this close to a woman built the way she was built. Feels strange, Asa admitted late in the afternoon, watching the new roof line go up clean and sound against a pale winter sky. Town spent years looking through me. Now half of it's up on my barn. Towns are like people, Ingrid said, wiping soot from her hands onto her apron. Slow to admit they were wrong. Quick to make up for it once they finally do, so long as somebody gives them the chance. You gave them the chance. We gave them the chance, she said. Wasn't just me standing in that storm. By sundown the barn stood whole again, sturdier, if anything, than it had been before the storm ever touched it, and the whole loose collection of neighbors and strangers turned something else entirely sat down, together at long tables set up in the yard, sharing food and a kind of easy talk that had nowhere existed in Asa's life since the valley, since the porch, since a mother who'd have loved nothing more than exactly this kind of gathering. He caught Ingrid's eye across the table at one point, firelight and lantern light, both catching the pale gold of her hair, and neither of them said anything at all. Didn't need to. Some things a look could carry better than words ever managed. A letter came for Ingrid in the first week of true winter, forwarded on through 3 towns before it finally found its way up the ridge road. Elsa's hand on the front of it, careful and looping, the same hand Ingrid had described once, by the fire, as belonging to a sister who hadn't yet learned to survive what Ingrid herself had already survived twice over. She read it alone first, out on the porch in the cold, and when she came back inside, her eyes were red-rimmed, but her mouth was doing something that hadn't happened, often since the night of the wreck, something close to a real smile. Unguarded. Uncomplicated. She's well, Ingrid said, before Asa had to ask. The debt's been forgiven. Word of Ambrose's trial reached Willow Bend faster than I expected, and the man he'd arranged it with lost his nerve once Ambrose's name started appearing in newspapers as far as St. Paul. She folded the letter with careful hands, the same care she gave everything that mattered to her. She says she might come out that way herself someday, to see the mountains, to see what her sister built instead of what she was sold into. She'd be welcome, Asa said. Simple. Honest. I know, Ingrid said. That's the part I keep having to remind myself is true. Winter settled in proper. By the time the cabin was fully repaired, storm damage from that night, patched, hinges, rehung, the forge out back glowing steady most mornings now, because Ingrid had taken to smithing work for half the ranchers in the valley, her reputation traveling faster than either of them expected once but got around about the woman who'd broken free of Garrick Ambrose's rope with nothing but patience and an iron file. One morning, early frost thick on the ground, Ingrid stood by the door with a small bundle over one shoulder. Asa watched her from the table. Didn't say anything at first. Didn't trust his voice to say the right thing if he tried too fast. You're leaving, he said, finally. Flat. Like saying it plain might somehow make it hurt less. I paid what I owed, Ingrid said, not quite meeting his eyes. The $100. The roof over my head while I healed. I fought beside you when it mattered. However you want to reckon the debt, I think it's settled now. It was never a debt I was keeping count of. I know. A small, careful smile. But I needed to hear myself say it was settled before I said the rest of it. Asa stood, crossed the room slow, the way he did most things now. Careful, deliberate, a man who'd learned the hard way what happened when he moved too fast toward things that mattered. Then say the rest of it, he said. Ingrid looked at him, really looked, the way she had that first night on the cot, sizing him up, deciding what kind of man stood in front of her. I don't want to stay because of $100, she said. I don't want to stay because I owe you, or because there's nowhere else for someone built like me to go, or because it's easier than starting over again. Somewhere new. Her voice caught, just slightly, the same crack he'd heard the night before the storm. I want to stay because this is the first place in my whole life where nobody's ever once asked me to be smaller than I am. Asa's chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with old grief. Then stay, he said. Simple, plain, everything he had left to offer, offered honest. Not because you owe me, because I'm asking. Ingrid set the bundle down. That's the first time you've asked me for anything, she said. Didn't think I had the right to before. And now? He almost smiled. The real kind. The kind that had been rare on him for years and had lately been coming easier than he ever expected it to again. Now I figure a man's allowed to ask, he said, once he's finally got something worth asking for. That night, they sat by the fire the way they had so many nights before, close now. No careful distance left between them, worth keeping. Ingrid mending a bridle, with hands that had broken free of Ambrose's rope and rebuilt a rusted forge, and, somewhere along the way, without either of them quite marking the exact day it happened, rebuilt something in Asa Whitlock that years of loss had nearly finished burying for good. He'd taken the quilt from the trunk that afternoon, the half-finished one his mother had never lived to complete, and set it, without much explanation, across the back of the cot. Ingrid noticed. Didn't say anything about it either. At first, just ran a thumb once over the faded rose-colored patch. Careful, the way she was careful with everything that mattered. She'd have liked you, Asa said, quiet. My mother would have had opinions about the forge taking up half the yard. Would have liked you anyway. I'd have liked to have opinions about her bread, Ingrid said. You've mentioned it enough times, mumbling over dying cattle, that I feel I half know the recipe already. Despite everything, despite the ache that Temery Porstel carried, Asa laughed, a real one, short and surprised out of him, the kind he hadn't heard from his own chest in longer than he wanted to count. He read to her from an old book after that, worn soft at the corners, his voice low and steady against the crackle of the fire. Outside, Snow fell quiet over the ridge. The same wind that had once owned this place, alone, uncontested, still moved through the pines, the way it always had. But it wasn't the only voice out here anymore. And inside, in the small warm circle of firelight, there was no grand speech, no declaration loud enough for the whole territory to hear. Just two people who'd both been sold, in one form or another, by circumstances neither of them chose who'd found, in each other, the first arrangement in either of their lives that had never once needed $100, or a letter, or a debt, to make it real. Just a quiet kind of peace, earned, this time, not paid for. And that, Asa thought, watching her hands move steady in the firelight, was worth more than any valley he'd ever lost. Spring came the way it always came in that country. Slow at first, reluctant, snow retreating, an inch at a time off the high ground, like it didn't quite trust the season's promises. Then, almost without warning, all at once mud giving way to green, the creek running loud and full, and clean the whole length of the valley, the forge behind the cabin ringing steady from sunup most mornings, with orders enough to keep Ingrid's hands busy through summer and beyond. It was on one of those mornings, warm enough finally, to leave the cabin door standing open, that a wagon came up the ridge road, unannounced, not a stranger's wagon, not this time, but one Ingrid recognized before it had even crested the rise, recognized by the shape of the horse or the tilt of the driver's hat, or some smaller thing entirely that only a sister would know. She was out the door and down the trail before Asa had fully registered what was happening, and by the time he caught up, Ingrid already had both arms around a girl not much past 17, dust-covered and wide-eyed and laughing, in a way that sounded like it hadn't been let loose in a very long time. "You came," Ingrid said, into her sister's hair, her voice doing something Asa had never once heard it do, before cracking open entire, no careful edges left on it at all. "You wrote that the mountains were worth seeing," Elsa said. "I decided to see for myself whether my sister was exaggerating." And Elsa looked past her, up at the ridge, at the pines standing tall and green against a sky scrubbed clean by winter, at the cabin with its mended roof and its forge sending up a thin curl of morning smoke, at the tall, quiet rancher standing a respectful distance back with an expression he was trying, not entirely successfully, to keep unreadable. "Not exaggerating," Elsa said. "Simple. Certain. Not even a little." That evening, the three of them sat out on the step where Ingrid and Asa had sat idle one Sunday morning months before, watching the light go copper and then gray over the western peaks, and Asa found himself, for the first time in more years than he cared to count, simply listening to two sisters catching up on lost time, to laughter that had no bitterness left in it, to the particular sound of a family finding its way back to itself after everything that had tried to tear it apart. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Some debts, he was learning, didn't get settled with money at all. They got settled slow, in evenings like this one, in sisters reunited on a mountain neither of them had ever expected to call home, in a peace that had cost both of them everything to earn and asked for nothing more, now, than the simple willingness to sit still and let it finally arrive. The end.